So, if you recall, last time I announced at the outset we were going to talk about Ucatastrophe, and I never got there, which was not a Ucatastrophe, nor a catastrophe even, but it was slightly frustrating as I went all over the place and talked about all manner of things, but you've probably got used to that by now. The way in which I tried to structure the discussion last time was in accordance with Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, which Tom Shippey mentions in his book, Tolkien, Author of the Century. And this class I wanted to expand on that. Actually, I'm going to get to Ucatastrophe as well, and connect it with the idea of true myth, which The Lord of the Rings is not, but it hints at the true myth. Now remember that phrase, true myth, was the one that Tolkien used to explain the Christian faith to Lewis, because both of them loved myths, and from boyhood days, and as we saw with Lewis's own writing on science fiction, it was the mythic qualities of science fiction that most attracted him to that particular type of science fiction that he was interested in, and which he also writes in his sci-fi trilogy. Although he's doing it against the backdrop of science fiction. So he's doing it in order to answer the way in which science fiction tends to so far deviate from the mythic or eternal quality of the world that it is impoverished and dehumanizing, and puts in its place transhumanism, which is in a sense seeking to attain eternal things by human means, and in the process perverting and distorting them. I said that last class, and I mentioned that these five types of literature that Northrop Frye delineates can all be found in The Lord of the Rings, and different characters represent those things. In general, the high mimesis, and I'm not going to go over what I said last class, is represented by the best human figures, like Éomer and Boromir. These are men like us that we would love to imitate. They tend to be the types that are the stuff of epics. These are epic heroes. But the one man who is in some sense like them insofar as he's a man, and in another sense unlike them, is Aragorn, and this is, I believe I concluded with something like this. Aragorn, on the other hand, seems to transcend them. He has the capacity to do things that they don't. So he can not only use the Palantir, it is right that he does so. He has the power to command the technological implements. He has the right to enter the city of Gondor. He can even summon the dead. Not only will he go down the paths of the dead, which epic heroes would do, but he can command them. Now, that is not something that we can find Odysseus or Aeneas do. They can't command the dead, other than by giving them a drink of blood. And that's not commanding them, it's just giving them a little draught of blood, and then they can speak for a time, but that's not really a capacity to command them. Whereas when Aragorn goes down, he actually commands the dead and tells them to follow him. So there's anyone with a knowledge of Western literature and the ideas of heroes going down to the dead, and those are just a couple of the instances, there are others, will know that the capacity to command the dead is not a mythic capacity, or not that even of a romantic figure. It's something that transcends human power. It's a godlike power. I did not yet get to the characters that were mythic, and so let me pick up with that before I moved on to the element of true myth, which is the Ucatastrophic element of the story. So, figures like Gandalf and Sauron. Don't worry about the cards. I don't care about it. Gandalf and Sauron, and even Tom Bombadil, these are figures that seem to defy human categorization, and they are. So in the case of Gandalf, And Sauron and Sauron, these are Maiar. They're creatures from another world. They're not really part of Middle Earth. They're there for a season and they will depart as well. They're a class of being that Tolkien invents. They're not angels. Some people think they're angels. They're not. But these figures almost reach a mythic dimension insofar as they, if you remember the categorization last time, they are characters that are superior in kind, not only to other people, but also the environment. They seem to be above that. They say they can master it. Now, I've talked about the wizards. How about this figure of Tom Bombadil? Because he's not like them. He's the eldest of all the creatures of the earth, but yet he's the master of it. It seems to me that he's very much like the figure of Merlin in That Hideous Strength. What does he master exactly? He masters nature. To some degree, he masters nature in its moral sense as well. Remember, the ring has no power over him. And he could use it, but he doesn't know what to do with it, and he actually doesn't value it. He could set it aside. In fact, he would probably lose it. We could let's give the ring to Tom. It doesn't seem to affect him. Yes, but also it's baffling to him, and he looks at it, and I mean, when Frodo puts the ring on, he can still see him. So he's an odd figure that seems to represent the right use of natural law, which would eventually, if you're reading Paradise Lost, before the fall, Adam and Eve, as they are being given choices in the garden, remember, we think about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're not to eat of that. We know the consequences of doing that. But what are the consequences of eating of the other trees and doing other things that were there available to them in paradise? Well, each choice that they made, other than that one, was a good choice. And the good choice would make them better. In other words, there is something like what in Eastern Orthodoxy they call theosis. The good choices in the garden were not only delightful, because Eden means pleasure, I believe, they were also a means of acquiring a knowledge of goodness and beauty and truth. And by so doing, they are becoming more godlike. So it's an ironic thing that Satan seduces Eve with the promise of becoming like gods, knowing both good and evil, when she was already becoming more godlike by just knowing good. And she just didn't seem to realize it. But that's what they were doing. Remember, as they were experiencing these things, they were knowing them in the biblical sense. It was becoming a part of them. They were being transformed. Because if things are good and God's called them good, they have an element of His goodness in them. So the acquaintance with the good, and remember the Philippians passage, whatever is good, whatever is beautiful, whatever is lovely, when you think about those things and you do those things, there's a process of moving closer to God in the process. It does not divinize you. I'm not there with the Eastern Orthodox tradition on the theosis or the capacity for it. I differ on that. But I do think theosis was possible in the garden before the fall. Now that sin has happened, I think that that way is shut. We find our full humanity in Christ and through repentance and depending on Him. Our means of theosis, in other words, is simply by clinging to Christ, who is God. But we can't go beyond our human capacities because of sin and the vestiges of sin. We remain sinners, whereas in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and to some degree in the Methodist tradition of John Wesley, which leans very strongly towards the East, the holiness movement, there is a sense that we can actually even overcome the vestiges of original sin. I quote my colleague Victor Shepard on this and say, well, show me that person, and I might start believing you, because I've never met that person. I see a lot of sinners walking around, and I'm one of them. And I'm not saying no progress in the Christian life can be made, but I've never met somebody yet that I thought was such a paragon of godliness that I thought theosis was happening. It's certainly not true of me. And the awareness of your own sinfulness is part of the awareness that you are falling short of God's standard, and it brings you to repentance, which is a step towards Him. So the humility, or the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, that is the theosis. But that's not the sort of progress that was being discussed in the garden. Did you?
Yes, sir. Theosis, is that just like it sounds? How
Yes.
it's spelled?
Yes.
Theosis?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I've never heard the term before.
It's big in Eastern Orthodoxy, and something like it is there in the holiness movement from Wesley and so forth. Wesley reads the Eastern Fathers far more than most Western Christians do, and it's part and parcel of the holiness movement, is becoming more pure, more devout, etc. It's not just piety. There's more than just piety being asserted there. There's a greater holiness, and with it there seems to me a blindness to sin in the community, and an absolute intolerance of it, in fact. So you can't accuse somebody in the holiness movement, which includes Pentecostalism, of being a sinner, because then it's contradicting the fact that they're a Christian. Because Christians can't have any sin in them. I don't think that's the biblical witness on sin. I think that the biblical witness on sin is that of the Apostle Paul. I'm a sinner. First point. I'm a forgiven sinner. Second point. Both things are true. I always remain a sinner. I never stop being a sinner. If you don't assert that, when somebody does sin and confesses their sin, you will say, well, you can't be a Christian because Christians don't sin. Well, what do you do with a person that sins? Or you throw them out. There's no place for repentance there, because the repentance, you've already said, that should have removed utterly the vestiges of sin from your life. So it's impractical, and I think it's actually cruel. And there's no pastoral care for that, and there ends up being an element of Pharisaism, because we can't admit that we're sinners. Or we already did that. That's when I came to faith. So the way that that's dealt with then is that you keep on having altar calls. You're going to need one every Sunday. And so, okay, well, there you go. Well, another altar. Well, I did that last week. I know, but I sinned it, so I'm going to have to do it again. Okay, well, in a way, okay. But is the altar call really dealing with that sin in a way that's helpful for you to master it? I haven't seen it. Anyway, so, but that sort of theosis there in the garden, I think Milton speculates on that to some degree, and the touch point for that was Tom Bombadil. He seems to represent a nature that is an unfallen. He's not subject to all of the other things, and so he can master it. And he doesn't even really know what sin is, and can't really thereby do anything with it. So again, go back to Lewis's book, That Hideous Strength, when we have Merlin. Merlin is a pagan. He understands nature, and he has a power over nature. But he doesn't, he could be co-opted in either direction. Just like Bombadil would eventually be destroyed with Middle-earth, so he can't withstand it ultimately, but he's not the instrument of destroying it. So he's not God. So he's part of the mythic dimension, but he's not the true myth. The true myth is the thing that will destroy, the thing that plagues even the mythic accounts. And I will get to that. Comments or questions before I do that? Yes?
As I read it, I was fascinated again, but what you just said, think of how he dealt with Old Man Willow.
Yes.
That's one thing I hated about the movie. They showed that happened in the forest of Fangorn, and it didn't.
Right.
And look at what Tom Bombadil said to Old Man Willow, and Old Man Willow complied.
Yes.
Okay, now think of his wife Goldberry, as opposed to Galadriel.
Yes.
I've always been fascinated about Goldberry and her role in all this too.
Yeah, and then the Ents versus the Entwives. I mean, Tolkien
Yeah.
regularly uses what in literature we would call foils. There are pairs of characters, just like in Shakespeare. There's a Edmund and an Edgar. You know, there are two characters that are very similar, and it's studying contrast, or sometimes it's just a comparison, but the two are there to help illustrate something about the other character. It works reciprocally. But yes, by pulling him, by pulling Old Man Willow out of Tom Bombadil's realm, clearly not an understanding of what Tolkien is doing with him at all. He just liked it, and I guess he wanted to keep it rather than check it. But Bombadil's not there at all in the movie, guys, right? So, but we can come to the shortcomings, or as I perceive them, but the differences in the movie. On fairy stories, Tolkien argued that fairy tales would have a glimpse, just a glimpse, of the true myth. Fairy stories themselves are myths, and they would have a glimpse of a truth that transcended them. It would be a sort of a revelation, and which is the Christian doctrine of Scripture is that this is God's revelation of Himself. You can't find this in the world. It's not. There is a book of nature, and the book of nature testifies to God. There's no doubt about it, but it's so intermixed with sin and distortion that it's not unambiguous. Whereas God reveals Himself in His Word and in His Son in an unambiguous way that no one could have even made up. And yet the old stories, like the fairy tales, to some degrees are like signposts pointing towards that. And so there are elements of what Tolkien will call Ucatastrophe that will break into the story. That's Tolkien's own invention, by the way, that word, Ucatastrophe. Let me break it down for you. Because you know catastrophe. So 3 Greek words. Good, down, turn. Basically. It's a good downturn, a Ucatastrophe. One of the ways in which theologians saw the fall of mankind, one of the ways, it's not the dominant one, and I think it does have its problems, is to see it as a fortunate fall. Challenging, problematic in some sense. How can we speak of anything as good or fortunate, which is a transgression of God's explicit command, which brings death into the world and all our woe? How can you speak of that as fortunate in any sense? In one sense, you can't. On the other hand, the theosis process that Adam and Eve were probably doing through their dominion mandate of cultivating the garden, being fruitful and multiplying, making the earth more like heaven. Remember the Lord's Prayer. That's the purpose. They're supposed to bring earth up to heaven through their own efforts. The result of their sin is that God will bring heaven down to earth through the seed, the woman's seed, through the paradise within, happier far, that will be given to Adam and Eve by faith in that promised seed. So it is a fortunate fall. It's a Ucatastrophe out of this terrifically awful event of original sin that brings, as I say, death into our world and all our woe. Nonetheless, God then enacts his rescue plan, and thereby brings about the theosis himself out of his own love. He does all the work, and we trust in his work by faith. It's his work. The gospel is his work, by the way. It's not our work. We can preach the gospel. The gospel is of him and what he did. What did he do and where did he do it? He did it at the cross. And when he was dying on the cross, he said, "Tetelestai, it is finished." What's finished? His life? Possibly. But more importantly, and certainly more correctly, his work is done. He has now done the very thing for which he said he was to come, which was to redeem sinners who are lost, which was the thing announced back in Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman would bruise his head, the serpent's. Just happened, just crushed it. And with him, sin and death. And so Paul says, "O grave, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting?" It's not there anymore. So that moment when Christ in his weakness and vulnerability is nailed to the cross, mocked by the soldiers, abandoned by his friends, a subject of scorn and suffering, a disgusting figure by any standard in the pagan world, a figure of terrific weakness, God works his mighty plan of salvation and strength at his point of weakness and through his point of weakness. It is a Ucatastrophe. It's the Ucatastrophe. Now, what does that have to do with Tolkien's story? Because I said this is not a true myth. The Lord of the Rings is not a true myth. It has a mythic quality. There are certain mythic beings, the Maiar, like Gandalf and Sauron, and to some degree, even this figure of Tom Bombadil has a mythic quality. Because remember, he's above mankind, but also above the natural world. He seems to be able to control it and do terrific things. So they're mythic, but they're not true myths. Gandalf doesn't even know certain things. He's limited even in knowing the knowledge of the ways of Iluvatar. So what is that moment? Well, the Ucatastrophe is a sudden and joyous turn. It's not an ending, by the way. It's not a happy ending. I'll get to the movie. I don't know if I'm going to get to it today or next class, but I think it'll be today. The movie, The Lord of the Rings, ends with a happy ending, a Hollywood ending. There are lots of Hollywood moments in the movie, but that's one of them. It ends with the marriage at the end. Okay. Tolkien says that there's no true end to any fairy tale. It just sort of concludes. It stops, but the story is not complete. But he says in a Ucatastrophe, we get a glimpse of joy that for a moment passes through the frame, rends indeed the very web of a story, lets a gleam come through, a gleam of revelation that almost comes from outside the narrative. It's just a flash of brightness, like pure, clear light. And Frodo is being spoken of by the file of Galadriel, this clear light of the star of, can't remember the name of the star, but it's the favored star of the elves that she gives him in the glass, which he can hold up. That light, which seems to be outside the cosmos, shines in moments, and there in the dark place there's a sense of that. But that's not the real sense. The Ucatastrophe comes in the chapter, the third and final, the field of Cormallen. Book 6, Part 4. Just to give you a sense of where this is just after Mount Doom, when Frodo and Sam and Gollum had destroyed the ring, and the army of the West, which is in the field of Cormallen, chapter, feels the realm of Sauron crumbling. So everything that can be shaken is being shaken. It's Hebrews 12 stuff. Right? You've come to the city of the living God where everything is like the whole world is shaking. Everything's being shaken up. Everything that can be shaken, whereas there are some things that cannot be shaken. Everything that God does. So the realm of Sauron is crumbling, and that we even witness a Sauron-like shape, stretching out a vast, threatening hand towards them. There's this a wraith. It's Sauron's wraith at that point, or sorry, it's terrible. It's like Saruman's wraith rather. So when Saruman is killed, there's a sort of a smoke that goes up, and the ground is blackened, and then he goes forward. You can't kill him, but you can take away his bodily existence, and now he goes wraith-like out, and the result of killing him, of course, is that the land is cursed, which will have to be healed. But let me not get off track. But Gandalf calls the eagles to take him to Mount Doom at that point. So they know, Gandalf knows, they did it. The hobbits have succeeded. Now they're in great trouble. He calls for the eagles again. They come along. And then the scene flips to Frodo and Sam. The movie does it rather well. So this flip back and forth. We go to Frodo and Sam. They have no idea what's going on outside. That the battle that was before the Black Gate, they know nothing about that, of course. And they have no hope of getting away. They've given up hope. We're going to die here. By the way, Frodo has no hope. Sam seems to have a little bit still. It's interesting. Because Frodo when he says he's got no hope, he's been totally consumed by the power of the ring. Remember, the ring is mine. He's been fatally wounded by it. But they fall unconscious. They're worn out. They're choked by the fumes and the heat. They're stricken by despair. They're hiding their eyes from death. And at that moment, they get picked up by Gandalf and the eagles in their talons, and they get flown away, and they're unconscious. They have no awareness. Their first memory is 2 weeks later, we're told. And they have no idea what's happened. Where are we? How did we get here? They're back in Ithilien. First person that Sam sees is Gandalf. Now, remember what the last time he saw Gandalf was. When was it? When he fell into the abyss. Last time he saw Gandalf, he died. The Balrog sucked him down into the abyss, and that was the end of him. And they're weeping, just like those that saw Christ killed. They're weeping because, of course, their hero has fallen. And he sees him. So what is he to make of this? Is Gandalf dead? Is he dead? Maybe he's died and gone to heaven. So he sees a face that he loved, but now a rather bright face, because he's Gandalf the White, not Gandalf the Grey. Because the light has broken in and pulled him somehow out from the pit. How that happens, that's itself part of the whole picture. Or even has heaven turned Middle-earth into an earthly paradise, like Adam and Eve would have created themselves through their own efforts? Is that's what happened? Has everything sad come untrue? That's his question? Has this earth been, the poison, has it been sucked out of it, and everything sad, and has it come untrue? It's no longer the case. Gandalf's reply is that a great shadow has departed. A great shadow. Note that he says a great shadow. It's not the great shadow, because as we know, the shadow has not departed. Or if we didn't see it, we're going to see it, because the Shire is going to still be scoured, and evil will perdure in a more insidious form. No longer the physical, incarnate representation of evil, it will now be a spiritual threat. But he then Gandalf tells him, now this is a fascinating point. Gandalf tells him exactly what day it is, and I'm going to quote this here. It's the 14th day of the new year, the 14th of the new year, or, if you like, the 8th day of April in the Shire reckoning. You say, so what? But in Gondor, the new year will always begin, now begin, upon the 25th of March, when Sauron fell. And when you were brought out of the fire to the king. So now, from this day onward, the years will be reckoned by this day. So it's a transformative event. The calendar will itself be changed in accordance with this event. Okay. Now this is the point of Tom Shippey, and I think it's a brilliant one. And it's note for yourself. No one any longer celebrates the 25th of March. Tolkien's point is accordingly missed, as I think he intended, Shippey writes. He inserted it only as a kind of signature, a personal mark of piety. However, as he knew perfectly well, in Old English tradition, the 25th of March is the day of the crucifixion, of the first Good Friday. The first Good Friday happens on the 25th of March. And this event happened on the 25th of March, according to human years. What they did, in other words, falls on the same day as the day we will refer to the event of the crucifixion. But of course, we don't know this because Good Friday is celebrated on a different day each year, and Easter is a mobile date defined by the phases of the moon, according to the lunar calendar. That there's some variation between different branches of Christendom on this. But as Good Friday is celebrated on a different day of each year, Easter being a mobile date defined by the phases of the moon, the connection has been lost, except for one thing. In Gondor, the new year will always begin on the 25th of March. And the same is true of England in a sadly altered and declined fashion. When the Julian calendar gives way to the Gregorian in 1752, there was an 11-day discrepancy between them. This is Shippey's note. So that the 25th of March jumped to being the 6th of April. And in England, the year still does start on the 6th of April. But only the tax year, he says. This is his point of view, which no one sees as a moment of Ucatastrophe. But it's part of the Christian calendar. Note that it's 9 months before Christmas. That is why Christmas is on December 25th, by the way. It's the birth of the Lord is connected with the death of the Lord, and the birth of the Lord is put after that, in a sense. So the meaning of the birth of Christ is connected with the death of Christ, and the one determines the other. Remember, the cross is the symbol of the Christian faith, universally acknowledged. Why did Jesus come? He came to die. So the birth is affixed to that day. It's also the day of the... so now I'll just read from Shippey here. 25th of March remains a day deeply embedded in the Christian calendar. In old tradition, again, it is the date of the Annunciation, when Mary is told by an angel that she will bear the Messiah. It's obviously the day of the conception of Christ. 9 months exactly before Christmas, 25th of December. It is also the date of the fall of Adam and Eve, by the way, in the church calendar. That day, 25th of March. Anyone born on the 25th of March here? That is the felix culpa, the happy sin I talked about, whose disastrous effects the Annunciation and the crucifixion were to annul or repair. Creation healed, restored. Paradise lost, paradise regained. Same event. Same date at any rate. Very different event. One through disobedience, the second through obedience. The one by man seeking to become as God, the other by God becoming as man. Talk about foils. One might note Shippey writes that in the calendar of dates which Tolkien so carefully wrote out in Appendix B, December 25th is the day on which the Fellowship sets out from Rivendell. The main action of The Lord of the Rings takes place then in the mythic space between Christmas, Christ's birth, and the crucifixion, Christ's death. Is this telling us something about Frodo? Are we meant to see him as a type of Christ, typological reading? Shippey says, I don't think so. I don't think so either. If Frodo is a type, he's only in a technical sense, which has been almost entirely forgotten, and in which the differences were more important than any similarities. He's got no promise of soul salvation, right? There's no typology there, and a type really has to, just like an allegory, has to be a lot more. He falls on the day, so that, in that sense, it's a very shadowy type, not a particularly robust one. So there's no salvation of the soul. He saved Middle-earth from great danger, okay, but sin remains. He doesn't release any prisoners from hell, as Christ will. Though they do get out of Sauron's dungeons. He doesn't rise from the dead himself. In fact, he doesn't even die. So there's no supernatural dimension to his deliverance at all. It's just a natural deliverance. But there are some aspects of it. It's just not typological in the Christian sense. Yes?
Do you think it also could be a comment on work-based salvation? Because what Frodo did was work-based, and it wasn't enough to get rid of sin and death altogether. Sure.
I don't think it was a comment on it, but we can make that comment on it. I don't think Tolkien was concerned with that per se. But you could certainly see that, and you would be right in seeing that. There's no means of salvation other than the one that Christ himself does. That's it. And if you try and add to it, then you've taken away from it. And if you try and take away from it, well, then you've taken away from it as well. That any attempt to change it is a subtraction. The Feast of Cormallen, furthermore, extends the Ucatastrophe. So this is the field of Cormallen after Mount Doom. Here's where the Ucatastrophe is, right there. Another view. So and another view is in Éowyn and Faramir, in the Houses of the Healing, right? They've been left behind in Minas Tirith. They feel the crash of the Dark Tower as well. They don't know what it means. They feel it as, and I quote, the stroke of doom. No, the stroke of doom, that word doom is judgment. It's an old English word for judgment. It's a divine thing. They feel it as that, says Tolkien. Faramir, it brings thoughts of the fall of Numenor. Quote, the great dark wave climbing over the green lands, darkness unescapable. So he has a terribly black thought, and he rejects the thought. And then the ego comes and announces what's happened in a very strange verse. And here's the verse. Sing and rejoice, ye people of the Tower of Guard, for your watch hath not been in vain, and the black gate is broken, and your king hath passed through, and he is victorious. Exact language of the Psalms, really. So that's the Ucatastrophe. It announces for us what has happened here. Your king references to Aragorn, of course. But now the king has been announced. He had refused to be announced as the king before. Remember, he wouldn't go into the city. But now he's been announced. Now that he's done, he's broken through the black gate. Now he's the king. And that's been revealed to them, and it's come on eagles' wings. The eagles are almost like the angels. Messengers, deliverers. Again, so comment here, and I'll read this. The Black Gate is Morannon, the north entry to Mordor. Your king is Aragorn. At the same time, there are strong hints of universal meaning. The image of people guarding a city is commonly applied in familiar hymns, like Martin Luther's Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, a mighty fortress is our God. a safe stronghold our guard is still. To Christians guarding the city of salvation, Christians are often urged in parable to watch, to stay awake, never knowing when the second coming will take place. The black gate is broken could be applied to the harrowing of hell, which took place between Good Friday and Easter Monday, between death and resurrection, when Christ led the souls of the patriarchs and the prophets out of infernal bondage. Eagle doesn't say that, of course. Yes.
It reminds me of the song, "Lift up your heads, O you gates, for the King of Glory shall come."
Yep, and that's what he doubtless intended. Who is their King of Glory? Well, here it's Aragorn. But the echoing is quite clear. So there are hints of the Christian message in it. For Christians, they're pretty strong hints. They're even stronger when you note the date, which he puts really in the background. It's in a footnote in the appendix, because he doesn't want it to be seen as a Christian allegory. He wants it to have an application to, but he doesn't, again, he's not writing an allegory here. If he did, then he would have to match it up all over the place, and he doesn't want to do that. That would in some ways be, he would be vying with the Creator, then he'd be writing like a romantic. He's a sub-creator, he's not a creator. His story will be understood rightly in accordance with the true myth. This is the way that I think that the Bible is properly to be read. All human stories are to be read in the light of the true myth of the Bible. And they partake of that true myth. But likewise, as we'll see next semester when we do the Bible as literature, the true myth has some of these features in it. So I agree with my old first-year English professor that if you don't read the Bible, you can't really understand English literature at all. You just can't understand it. It's the master story, and
Who
it's
said
not.
that? Your professor?
Yeah, at Huron College.
Oh.
Corey Davies,
Oh, wow.
same one who taught your friend at.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we both had her.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, this is the end, Sam Gamgee, said Frodo. The end of all things. Sam tries to tell him there's hope yet. Frodo replies, and what he says retains a conviction which doesn't go away from him because he's without hope. He says, it's like things are in the world. Hopes fail. An end comes. He's defeated. He's defeated. He can't stay. He's going to have to be, for his work, he will be taken into the undying lands, but he himself is so broken that he can't be healed. On this element of Ucatastrophe, he adds, in its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. That is Ucatastrophe. Ucatastrophe is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. So there's no natural foreshadowing or anticipation of it. It just breaks in when it's least expected. Deliverance. You can't time it. You don't know when, Christ will come again. We're told to watch and wait. When will he come? When will that day be? You get people saying the end of the world is nigh, it's going to be on whatever day, April 6th, 9th, whatever. I never understand why people say that. If they're literalists, then why don't they listen to Christ? As even he doesn't know when that day will be. No one knows it but the Father. But apparently these people do know it's going to be, next year, April 6th. It does. So he says there's a sudden miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, which is the opposite of it. Catastrophe, an evil downturn. Sorrow and failure. the possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. So God in some sense, he needs. The one is a condition for experiencing the Ucatastrophe. The fall is a necessary condition for experiencing the true nature of grace, which is God saves us. We do nothing to save ourselves. How much should we love God? Well, Adam and Eve had the choice. Now God so loves us that he loves us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. Adam and Eve would never have known that. So the magnitude of his love is evident precisely because of their disobedience. That's the Felix culpa, the fortunate aspect of the fall. But I go on to read from fairy stories. He says, the possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. Evangelium is simply the good news, right? The U, or the U in Greek is often rendered as a V in Latin. Angel is a messenger, but also the message, the good news. The God spell, the good news, the good magical words. The spell in Anglo-Saxon means a story, but it's also a magical story. The God spell, it's the story of the deliverer who breaks in through miraculous grace in unexpected ways in a manger, in a cave outside of Bethlehem. That's a story that could never have been even imagined. Anyway, comments or questions before I progress to the movies? Yes?
I really appreciated that you included the space trilogy at the outset.
Yeah.
What you just said today, it all ties in.
Good, that's the whole point. I'm coming to the end of the course and I'm trying to draw threads together.
Because all of deep heaven marveled at what Malala did for Felkandra.
Right. This is Hru. They see Ransom's ankle, it's been bit, right? And it won't stop bleeding. You can't stop, and it doesn't stop bleeding. In that hideous strength, he's still bleeding. It can't. This is Hru. The substance, and they're all looking around, marveling. This is the substance wherewith Mal-Eldil remade the world's blood. The Savior who bled, and the blood was the thing that remade the world. Yeah. The cosmic dimension, right? Not just so Jesus Pantocrator, the ruler of all things. Yes.
How should we read the scene and understand kind of like that?
That's a myth. That's the myth. Yeah. It's not the true myth, it's the myth that, so the mythic dimension, there are a few characters there like Gandalf and Sauron and so forth. They seem to belong to the mythic dimension. Silmarillion is to be understood as myth. This story is really on the level of romance. Although it has elements of the high mimesis, there are just men like Boromir and Faramir and these great figures. And there are the low mimesis, characters like the hobbits, and then even moments of irony in that, say, that fit in that. But in general, there's a romance to it. It's a story that is terrific and seemingly in some ways epic in scope. But by a romance, we simply mean the characters are superior in degree, not in kind to other men. So they're like epic and tragic heroes. They're like King Oedipus. They're like Odysseus. They're greater in degree, but not kind. And they're also greater than their environment even. They seem to be able to transcend that. but they're not totally different, and they have power over it. Magnificent man. Okay. Other comments, questions? So that's the Ucatastrophic element. It just breaks in there unexpectedly in that moment. And those moments are dealt with reasonably in the movie, I guess. They're not strongly emphasized in the way that Tolkien does, but I'm not sure that they could be or should be even. I think the Gandalf coming to Sam and Frodo, and the room is bathed in light. Everything's in white, including Gandalf, and like the light in the room. It's really well done. So he has captured something of it. On the other hand, he has missed the whole point of I'm not sure what the worst omission in the story is, but it's probably the fact that evil persists beyond the destruction of the ring. In the book. In the movie, it doesn't. Right? It ends there, and then it ends with, you could say this is a Christian way of ending it even. You've got the king, and then you've got his bride, the city, the bride coming together, Revelation 21 stuff. Right? That's how it ends. They're up on a high, and now we have Arwen, who was dying, and now he has his heroic act has saved her, and they are married. Great ending, and everybody's cheered at the end. It's sort of like a Star Wars ending, actually. Unfortunately. Because the Star Wars movies can't hold a candle to this story. But yes.
There's still the feeling at the end of the movie where Gandalf is leaving and the world's not going to be the same. So there's still kind of like that feeling that...
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, but what does that mean? I mean, it's very dim. You're right, because they're going to go off, so we deal with their stories. If it even worse would have been to leave that out. But like, why does he have to go then? Like, it's been wiped out. So it's a little bit mysterious, and at least he leaves us with that. Like, why did they have to go? Well, now it's the Age of Men, Gandalf announces. So now the Third Age has ended, and now it's the Age of Men. There's no more of this. This dimension is gone. The romance dimension. And now it's the high mimesis of the epics and the tragedies, which our world tells about. But that element where it's something superior to that, and the mythic creatures, they're all gone. There are stories that are told in the long past that are no longer true of our world. Right, so now it's from here downwards. But as Fry notes, there are a lot of stories in the English language and in other languages that have mythic qualities and romance qualities. Or romance would be like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, by the way. That's a type of romance. Almost supernatural figures. Yeah. So he does not allow evil to persist. He doesn't deal with Sauron, who now takes on the guise of Sharky, a much debased character. So he's no longer the great wizard that he was. He is now... all he's interested in is spoiling and wrecking things. He's angry at the hobbits, and he wants to wreck their world. So he no longer wants the power of Sauron. He just wants to... he's become more wicked and more pathetic. And he turns the Shire into a industrial wasteland, which I think is Lewis or Tolkien's intent here. It's the effect of mechanization of the world and the power of humanity exerting a power over nature without any care for the moral consequences or even the physical consequences. Just making it ugly. Just like he did when he was creating those fighting Uruk-hai. his eugenics experiment, which is in the movies. But there's having that experiment having failed and his army of Nazis having been destroyed at Helm's Gate, he remains wicked. It's not so if you want to see this as a metaphor or in some ways an allegory of the Second World War, Tolkien first of all says that's ridiculous. I never intended that. And even if you did, well, what do you do with after the fighting Uruk-hai have been destroyed then? And now what do you do with Saruman? What is he? What does he symbolize? It doesn't seem to really fit the Second World War at all. So that is a clear problem. Now, the other problem with that is a theological one, not just it departs from the story. You'd say, well, so what? I mean, he's filmed a movie for 12 hours, like the three of them together. That's about the longest movie I've ever seen, at least coming out of Hollywood. So that's extraordinary. He's managed to put so much into it. And he has to cut some things out. So let's give him, at least give him a little bit of charity here. Not be too hard on him. But what's the effect of that? Well, it is to suggest that good conquers evil in such a way that evil's gone.
I see.
Which not even the true myth will tell you. So it's denial of the gospel. Christ has conquered sin and death, yes, but sin and death remain in the world, and the gospel is to proclaim what the king has done until he comes again, at which point then sin and death will be gone. But he's not in his own book going to eradicate sin and death from the world, because then there would be no need for Christ to come either. It's a Hollywood happy ending. It destroys the story, and it no longer even remotely it's no longer remotely like the gospel then. So it's a bad oversight, theologically speaking, and for Tolkien it would be, and mythically speaking, I mean everything about it's bad. So it's a terrible conclusion. Furthermore, it presents good and evil as powers in the world. So this is a second point, although it's connected to it. It presents good and evil almost as physical beings in a dualistic or even a Manichaean sense. It doesn't quite do it, but there's a physical good and there's a physical evil. It can't do this entirely because the evil's in the company as well, and he doesn't depart from the books wholly. But there's a sense that the good and the evil actually are represented or even entirely coextensive with certain figures. So when Sauron is defeated, evil is defeated. But Sauron isn't the embodiment of evil. He is an embodiment of evil. And his forces are not the embodiment of evil, they're an embodiment of evil, and it can take on other embodiments. But you wouldn't know that from the way the movie concludes. The evil's gone. Saruman is killed in the movie. And Sauron is defeated, destroyed. The tower falls. The eye sort of goes down with it. So it's a physical conquest. Well, this is a serious distortion of Tolkien's notion that evil is most of all a spiritual battle, not a matter of flesh and blood. You can say you like the movies. I like the movies. It's just this is no longer Tolkien's story at all when you do that. And then you get rid of Tom Bombadil. He's not in it either. To be fair to him, how on earth would he present it? It would just be like, who's this weirdo? And Gold, like, what's going on with that? That one's hard for everyone to understand. So he cuts that out. But with that there is a right and goodness in creation, which is genuinely fully good and is not under the dominion of evil, or at least so it was in the beginning. So evil is not a part of this world. And Tom Bombadil represents that goodness and the original power of Adam and Eve over it, the dominion. So that's a bit further afield. The other thing it cuts out a lot are the songs and the stories.
Yeah.
Those are purged from it, which is unfortunate. Probably less unfortunate than the things that I just mentioned, but still, it's those scraps of, not even scraps, lengthy extracts of song and hymn-like stories from the past, connecting the past to the present, and uniting them in a joyous celebration, which really lends a lot of richness to the story and adds furthermore a historical dimension, whereas this seems like a self-contained story that really isn't connected to the past or to the present. It's just a story. It's a fiction. It's made up, whereas Tolkien, he's not going to say it's a true myth, but he's going to say that all myths have a truth to them. Otherwise, they're not very good stories. We don't want to read them, or at least if we read them, we'll never read them again. It has to, in some ways, be a comment on reality. Good fiction does that. And his certainly does that, and so does Lewis's. That's why we continue to read it. It seems to be a commentary on our own lives. It has an application to our lives. It's not just of relevance to the story of the Christian story, but our stories, and that's because it has a historic application. But if it's just a story and doesn't seem to unite the past with the present and with the future, then it becomes just a very different thing. And so it loses the dimension of piety. Piety. This is really important, actually. What is piety? Who's the figure in literature we know for piety? Spoken of as pious. Can you recall? Did him in first year. Epic, first year. Yes?
Aeneas.
Thank you. I had to narrow it down, but you got it. Pious Aeneas. This is the thing for which he is chiefly lauded. It is his piety which is the quality which is most praised by Virgil. How do we see his piety? What makes him so pious? He reveres his ancestors. He carries around his household gods, his own little cult, his own. It's never mind that it's a cult and it's idolatry. It's his religion. It matters to him. His ancestors matter to him. More importantly, or at least as importantly, so does posterity. He is to do it, if not for himself, then do it for little Iulus. Who is Iulus? His son, also called Ascanius. So you're going to leave, remember he leaves Carthage, he leaves Troy, which has been brought down to ruin by the Greeks, and the Trojans then depart, and they end up first of all in Carthage, where he falls in love with Dido, whom he loves, and then leaves her because he was pious. What do we mean pious? He had a vocation to ground the city of Rome and leave it to his son Iulus. Now, who's Iulus other than his son? Well, his son is going to be one of the ancient families of Rome, the Julii. So his name is Iulus, obviously with it. From which we'll get Julius Caesar. who adopts Augustus Caesar as his son. By the way, in the Roman family unit, there is only one person who has human rights, and that's the father. His children are not his children until he adopts them. When they get to a certain age, then he will adopt them if he's happy with them, and if they're not, he can kill them. Or they can become delegitimized. It's up to him, but he has to adopt them, even when they're adults. So they, as I say, not only is infanticide permissible in Rome, it's regularly practiced, children can be disinherited or even killed by their father for any reason, at any time. Fathers have absolute power over their children until they adopt them. Once they adopt them, then that person becomes an heir. So adoption is key. So Julius Caesar adopts Augustus as his heir. That becomes more his natural child than any of the others. This is the man who's going to inherit my title. And with his title goes all the way back to this fellow. So there's a piety there in Aeneas. He is going to turn his back on what he loves most in life, which, as it turns out, is not only Troy, but Dido, for the sake of others. This is piety. And he does it out of a sense of reverence for his own parents, but also of posterity. Now, it's also a Christian virtue, piety. What do we mean by piety? What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Where does that come from, by the way? You got it right. Deuteronomy 6. Shema, O Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You are to love the Lord your God, etc. And then you are to teach it to your children. These things I say to you, and they are to write it. So, it's what is piety? Love the Lord your God and teach it to your children. That's the original venue for which that greatest commandment is given. What's it connected to? Education. If you love God, then you'll educate your children as Christians. That's commanded by God in Deuteronomy 6. It's repeated in Ephesians 6, verse 4. Don't provoke your children to wrath, it says. Whose wrath? God's wrath. But bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The paideia and the nouthesia of God. That's what you are to do. So the piety there is in loving God, first commandment, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who's your neighbor if you're a parent? The kids. That's your neighbor. Your nearest neighbor, the one dependent on you. It's an act of piety. It's also an act of sacrifice. You got to put your children's needs ahead of your own. You can't just leave them on a weeknight. Go out as you used to go. That's piety. So there's a piety there. So it's those two things. Now it's also within the church. But it's primarily now a devotion to God, just like Aeneas was devoted to his household gods. We are devoted to our gods, and we express that, firstly through that, but also through the way we treat our children. And then from that, that narrow household realm, it spills out to those around us. But those are not our nearest neighbors. Our nearest neighbors are within the home. Then they move out to the people that live around us, and then they move out to the city gates, which is the whole of our political life and social life. Now that then becomes, so all of those things, which are the context of Deuteronomy, become true of Christians as well. So there's a Christian view of culture, and it's rooted in love and piety. So that's the transference of it, and it applies here. Yes?
Going back to the adoption thing, so
yes?
scripture where it says, for you have received the spirit of adoption whom we cry out, Abba, Father.
Yes?
So assumably when that audience is being spoke to about this, they would have had this idea of adoption in mind, that it's strictly from the father.
Yes,
that is able to do
absolutely. But he also says you no longer to be as orphans.
Yeah.
Also, key, probably even more so in our day, when the model of the orphan as the role model, we all should think of ourselves as orphans. What is the model of an orphan in your own eyes duty or view of how you relate to your parents? They have no legitimacy over me. I'm to determine what's good for myself, and I'm going to find out by looking within myself. What do I like? What are my desires? that will determine who I am. I have to figure it out. I have superpowers, just like Harry Potter. Or Spider-Man or whatever. Or the characters from Frozen, little girls. Same thing. Myth of the Orphan. What's her name? Elsa. I should know. I just hear the song often enough. Kids love that. Elsa and Anna. Really interesting story, actually. But again, the power she can't control within her. She's going to learn to control it. She's afraid of it. She overcomes her fear. How? Through a sort of a sacrifice. An act of true love. Who does that? Well, her sister. Sister is willing to take the punishment she does. So there's a Christian aspect to the story, for sure. But the model of orphanage is the sense that we are to make a sacrifice ourselves that will somehow replace the sacrifice which happened 2018 years ago, which is a total denial of the truth. So it's a romantic replacement of the Christian story with a secular version of it. And it promotes the orphan, whereas Christianity promotes the family. And piety. Piety now means nothing. In the orphan myth, piety means being true to yourself. That's, in fact, what you're told. You have to be true to yourself. I can't remember which the band was. I'd like to find your inner child and spank his little blank. No? Okay. You'll find that little inner child within you. Yeah.
Professor, it would be one thing if all he did was drop characters because he didn't have the time to flesh it out.
Yes.
But when he tinkers with characters, I get exasperated.
So Faramir, we've talked about Faramir as
Yeah.
well, right? So one of the great heroes of Middle-earth, without a doubt. Fully, like, he is a real hero.
Yeah.
And a foil for Boromir, who's also heroic, but more of a physical hero, although he has valor, but he lacks wisdom. Right, so that's one of so he doesn't just tinker with it, he destroys him. He makes him he's sitting there and he sees a picture of his dad, he's got tears going down his face. Well, fine, I mean, that's okay, but Daddy, it's like, come on.
He never takes
No.
Gollum, Frodo, and Sam to Osgiliath
Also,
in the book.
yeah,
He lets them go.
yeah. I don't know why he puts that in there, actually.
And, well, I have to bring the ring home to Denethor, to my father.
Yeah, right.
And then in the movie, they actually show Denethor putting pressure on Faramir to do it for that reason.
Yeah,
And that's not in the book.
yeah, yeah. And I don't know why he puts that in.
It certainly...
Other than it shows he's a rebel. So what it does, it makes Faramir a rebel against his father. And then he cries because he's not loved by his dad. Well, I mean, what the heck?
Yeah.
Like, why? That's just weird.
He's noble. I love his nobility.
Yeah,
Faramir.
so do I. But
And just-
that's really right. So he really suffers almost more than any character in that sense. No, I totally agree. So if you've only ever watched the movies, it's unfortunate. I almost wish people wouldn't see the movies, but certainly not before they read the books. Because the effect of a visual image is it sticks with you longer than the words do. It's problematic. Whereas words not only go into your mind, it allows your imagination to reign, and it also changes your character, because character is an internal thing, not an external thing. So I can look like Aragorn if I grow my hair long and have a beard and dress in the clothes, but the real Aragorn that's being presented in the book is a character. He has a moral attributes. That's the Aragorn. Never mind, he doesn't look like Viggo Mortensen. Right, so and that's just the problem of the medium of film, I think, more than anything. So that's not the fault of Peter Jackson, per se. That's the inherent weakness of the medium. And I do think that the best, obviously biased, the best form of art is the word. It has a music to it, and it creates images. I'm told that people here are visual learners. Well, I give visual teaching all the time. It's through words. Now you can visualize it. It's far more potent than if I put pictures on the screen, which always captures a bit of it but leaves out another bit, and then you forget the other bits. You're left with the image. And remember, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He is the image of the invisible God. What did he look like then? Where's the description of Jesus in the Bible? Where is he described? He isn't. He's not described. Not at all. He's a man. He's a Palestinian Jew. He's a Jew, so he would have been circumcised. Okay, well, again, okay, we're not going to worry about that. Right? You don't want to, But the answer is we don't care, and it doesn't matter. Obviously, he had an appearance, and he would have been recognizable in some sense, but totally irrelevant. And the circumcision is only to show us that he is a true child of Israel, right? So he's, yes.
He is described as the Word as well.
As the Word, yeah. Well, have you seen a word? Right. So it's more. So the important attribute of what we see is what we hear. By what we hear, we will see. You see. So the gospel is something that we hear and we believe even when we can't see him. So there are some people who say, if I could see Jesus in front of me and he would do these things, I would believe. I don't think so, because there were people that followed him for 3 years called disciples that didn't believe in him as we know him now, even though they saw him every day. So seeing him is not convicting in and of itself. And yet when he died and taught them after he rose and gave him their spirit, then they were so convicted by who he was that they were willing to die for him, and they never would renounce him. Before, when they saw him, they would. Now that he's dead and has given their spirit, they know exactly who he is, and they won't. It's so clear and so real that they will not allow any contradiction to come from their mouths. So it's not a visual thing at all. It's a matter of conviction. It's a matter of the heart, and it's something that's not seen then, or it will be seen in the way that they act, which is Hebrew logic once again. If you believe, then you will do. So that's just the problem of TV and movies and visual images. And the problem with your technological devices then with that is they bankrupt you of your imagination and corrode your character. And the way they do it is by giving you power. Power without moral responsibility. Lust of the eye and the lust of the flesh, depending on what you look on it. But there's a gratification that gets there, but there's no character development that takes place. Yes?
Why do they think that songs would bore audiences?
I don't know.
Didn't used to be that way.
No.
Disney's Song of the South,
I know.
Uncle Remus's stories was almost entirely song.
Yeah, if you look at the old Disney movies, they have a lot of songs in it, and it's just it has disappeared from Western culture almost. When I say Western, North American culture, there are no common songs. They have to sing na 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 at the end of the movie. Hey hey goodbye. That's it. God, that's it. You know, like it's an inane, idiotic. Like I want to kill people, blow them up when they sing that stupid song.
And the end song that's
it's like a 2-year-old could sing that song. You adults. Anyway, but they're not in football matches in Europe. They have songs. They make up songs. I think there's something good about that. The corporate singing. Yes, it's a great loss. Particularly among young men. Young men don't like to sing because it's what? It's not very masculine. Terrific loss. If you think about what happens when you sing, your joy comes with singing, and corporate singing in particular. There's that experience of a corporate identity and being lifted out of your own situation. Of course, the words really matter then. But still, singing corporately has a terrific, even a personal bodily effect. Like your lungs open up and your spirits are lifted along with it.
And even laments, like Treebeard's Song of the Entwaters.
Oh yes,
it's beautiful.
Of course, yeah.
And all they give is a few little snippets, and Pippin and Merry are asleep on his shoulders in the movie. just a few. It's not.
Sure.
They don't even explain that this is the song of the Entwives.
No.
And
Well,
it's
because they
like,
didn't. Yeah. They again, that would have been too much of a digression.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay, we're done for today.